Let's pick up things there with a segment we like to call That Was a Week That Was. Our guest tonight on Capitol Insider, Jack Berkman, Republican strategist and president of Berkman Associates, and Richard Fowler, Democratic strategist and host of the Richard Fowler Show on We Act Radio 1480 AM. You can hear him every Friday night. So we've heard both candidates blame his opponent for super PAC ads this week. How much responsibility should they bear, Jack?
I mean, there's responsibility all the way around. This is an election year issue. This thing hits both parties. But I'll tell you, some of Obama's ads, some of these super PAC ads are just terrible. I mean, the attacks on Romney for Bain Capital, this idea somehow Mitt Romney put people out of work. As an investment banker, he had to make decisions that would help his companies. That's the law. That's what you do as a banker. Somehow Obama's putting forth this idea that if Mitt Romney was running this company and you have 200 people sitting here in this building and you don't need them anymore, that for social purposes you have to keep them employed, and the fact that Romney didn't do that, somehow he's some evil man who hurt the poor and the middle class in the United States. It's some of the worst deception. I mean, we see a lot of this in a presidential year, but it's some of the worst deception in ads that we've seen in so many decades.
Not just that, but Richard, this ad essentially implies that it's Romney's responsibility for this woman's death because she wasn't covered by insurance. About 5 years after he had left Bain and after this man lost his insurance, she died of cancer. I mean, this is a particularly nasty tone here, isn't it, this early in the campaign?
Well, I think the point of the ad was to sort of show who the real Mitt Romney is, because the Romney campaign has not defined who Mitt Romney is, and what the ad talks about is what was the work that he did at Bain Capital, and part of that work was going into corporations and firing people and hiring them at lower wages. The example that they give in this commercial is just one example of who the real Mitt Romney is, what he did with KB Toy Store. When Bain Capital acquired KB Toy Store.
But what's that have to do with a woman's death?
It's the same, but no, it's the fact, it's what Bain Capital is willing to do to make profits. They're willing to do anything to make profits, including firing people for absolutely no reason.
But I guess my question, what's that have, I just reiterate, what's that have to do with a woman's death?
Because she was fired, she no longer had health care insurance,
well, that doesn't mean
she died.
She was eligible to get chemotherapy.
The effects of Mitt Romney's actions resulted in her death.
Oh, come on, Richard, that's so silly. You mean in the United States for decades, you know better than that. People can go to the hospital and get treatment. Whether
if she had a health insurance, she'd be able to go to the hospital. Unfortunately, Romney fired her. She didn't have health insurance, and this is before President Obama passed the comprehensive health care reform, so she didn't have health insurance that way either. So she was sort of stuck. Maybe if she was in Massachusetts, she would have had health care.
A lot of political analysts are saying that this election cycle is going to be about drawing the most voters to the polls. And I guess the question is, does this tone on both sides, the super PACs and the traditional campaign ads, being so nasty and cynical and negative this early on, doesn't this risk on both sides? Don't you think they're thinking we're going to alienate some of these voters? They won't want to vote for either candidate.
You're completely right. That's exactly what's going to happen. But this is a result of the Citizens United decisions and the fact that corporations are people and they can just put unlimited amounts of money into commercials and ads. They should be regulated, and that's part of the problem. We need to repeal Citizens United and take money out of our politics so this doesn't happen.
Well, Jack, is that the solution?
You're right. Your question is a good one, Mike. The issue is that both candidates, and we're all in the same boat with this, both Obama and Romney are having trouble rallying their bases. So both of them have a political motive to use these kind of dirty ads. I think Obama's worse than Romney, but both of them are using strong ads early on. I stipulate to that, I admit that, because both of them are having trouble rallying their own partisans. So you're right, they turn off voters, but the voters they turn off are the swing voters in the middle. Right now, both candidates are focused on their own bases because they're having so many problems with the base.
Richard, you coined a catchy description of Romney a few weeks ago, calling him, quote, pale, stale, and male. President Obama may have one up to you this week. Let's listen.
Governor Romney's plan would effectively raise taxes on middle-class families with children by an average of $2,000. To pay for this tax cut, not to reduce the deficit, not to invest in things that grow our economy like education or roads or basic research. He'd ask the middle class to pay more in taxes so that he could give another $250,000 tax cut to people making more than $3 million a year. It's like Robin Hood in reverse. It's Romney Hood.
Catchy maybe, but critics argue that line of attack is rooted in social justice, not economics, is it?
Well,
They're one and the same. They're totally, completely, and totally one and the same. And I think the president really goes off with the comment that I made last week. Mitt Romney, not only is he pale, stale, and male, but he wants to gut the middle class. He wants to gut the working class, and not to reduce the deficit. He wants to do all of this to give tax cuts to millionaires, billionaires, and corporations.
Well, first of all,
not to mention the fact, Jack, that Mitt Romney has not issued a clear tax plan.
Right,
and he criticizes the bipartisan group that judged his tax plan, saying that they're not bipartisan, they're partisan. But if the Romney campaign would release a tax return, we would know.
Let's say this. First of all, let's start with the beginning. If Jack Berkman were running for president, I would boldly say you should raise taxes on the middle class because they don't pay any taxes. Now,
that's not true.
That's just not true. Romney is not raising taxes on anybody. So what Obama's doing, what Harry Reid's doing in the Senate, he's now taking this to a still lower level. He's resorting to outright lies. Romney's tax plans, nothing he's put forward because
that's not true.
Since the beginning of the primaries and
Jack,
now
that's just not true.
Would raise taxes on anybody. And somehow Obama is now just fabricating, he's like Harry Reid, he's just fabricating stories.
Richard, how is this Robin Hood in reverse line any different than all the Joe the Plumber controversy that we saw in 2008?
Well, it's completely different because Romney showed himself. He showed his true colors. He really is a Romney Hood or a Robin Hood in reverse. At the end of the day, in his tax plan, they would get rid of a lot of tax credits that goes to middle-class families, like the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, the college tax credit. These would all be eliminated under his plan, which would effectively raise taxes on the middle class.
All right, you see now the argument. Okay, now at least Richard is honest. At least now you see the argument. He's arguing that he's translating the elimination of any tax credit into an increase in income tax on people. With arguments like that is a logic that is so attenuated and so
How is that attenuated at all?
You can
the
argue,
government is taking more money away from the middle class. How is that not a tax increase?
You can argue. Let me tell you something. If you want to make arguments like that, you can argue that virtually anything is a tax increase on anybody.
Not when you're lowering the rates. Not when you're lowering the tax rates of rich millionaires and billionaires, so they pay less in taxes when they already only pay about 14%.
Let's move on. Let's move on here, gentlemen. This week, Romney released his own attack ad. It claims that Obama wants to end welfare's work requirements. Of course, the Washington Post, New York Times, and many other media outlets call its claims blatantly false, pants on fire. In fact, one fact checker called it. Romney stands by this ad, Jack.
Well, you know, I think he should. I mean, Obama has got it. I don't think there's anything not true about it. I'll tell you, you saw the story yesterday in Massachusetts. I mean, you see this terrible stuff they're doing with welfare checks. When people get their welfare check, there's this subliminal message, and sometimes a very overt message, that you have to support the incumbent, Governor Deval Patrick, and you have to support the incumbent, Barack Obama. This stuff is starting to go on all over the country. They want to create in the mind of the welfare recipient that they've got to somehow support the incumbent administration if they want their check. I think the ad's very accurate. I'd encourage Mitt Romney to stay with it.
But Jack, that includes 2 Republican governors who have called for this flexibility in terms of their welfare programs in their states.
Well, that's true. I mean, you have a lot of governors. I mean, I've been very critical of governors. You have a lot of governors that aren't very conservative. I mean, there are a lot of governors, a lot of Republican governors that haven't done the right thing and have raised taxes and have run from cutting the budget. So, yeah, I'd be the first one to admit that.
Richard, what does it say about this election cycle that all these outlets are calling this blatantly false, and yet the Romney campaign is not backing away from this ad?
It just shows what Romney's willing to do to win. He's willing to do anything possible to win, even at the regard of lying on the President of the United States. The truth of the matter is what the President's actually done is what Republican governors, including Mitt Romney when he was governor of Massachusetts, wanted them to do. What they did was they allowed the states to implement how the work requirement goes. Certain states chose to make it, they chose to alter, but they can't get rid of the work requirement. It's against the law to do that. It's against the federal law, and Congress has enacted. That's just the truth.
The bottom line is what Obama has done. I mean, let's talk about facts. The fact is Obama has grown out the sea of poor people that are dependent on the federal government. A person like Obama doesn't survive in power unless you have a sea of desperately poor people in the U.S. who depend more and more on the federal government. That's the only way you can ever elect a person like Barack Obama. You build out these dependencies. You build out these welfare dependencies with the poor.
Jack, let's talk about its convention season. Let's talk about the VP buzz. I know, Jack, you're rooting for North Dakota Senator John Thune, but there's, of course, a lot of buzz this week, especially among conservatives, about Paul Ryan and the VP nominee. So what do you see as Paul Ryan's strengths and maybe weaknesses?
Well, you know, I love Paul. I've known Paul since he worked for Jack Kemp in an organization 20 years ago called Empower America. If you go with Paul Ryan, it's hard for me to discuss him because he's a personal friend, but if you go with him, just thinking about it objectively, it's a play to the base. Conservatives love him. So at that point, if Romney picks Paul Ryan, It's a real play to the base. Ryan will turn off independent voters. He'll turn off greatly swing voters because we're going to be accused of falsely, but we'll be accused of wanting to cut Social Security and cut Medicare, and we have to defend the Ryan plan and the Ryan budget, which politically, I admit, will be hard. So it's a complete play to mobilize the base. If Romney does that, I think it suggests that in his mind, he believes himself to be an underdog.
And Richard, I know you and other Democrats salivate at the idea of having him as the VP pick.
That's exactly right. I think Jack said it best. He will alienate senior citizens. He'll alienate the poor. He'll alienate the middle class because the Ryan budget is full of horrible things. It cuts programs such as women, infants, and children, a program that will go to make sure that they have proper nutrients. It privatizes Social Security and Medicare. All these programs that seniors don't want, the middle class doesn't want, and the working poor in this country don't want.
All I can say is I love the Ryan budget, and I think it's the best.
I'm glad you do,
It
Jack.
might be the only thing that would save the country from becoming like Italy and Spain, but the problem is in 90 days, I don't think people like I are creative enough to defend it.
All right, Jack Berkman, Republican strategist, Richard Fowler, Democratic strategist, thank you both for your time tonight.
Thank you, Mike.